Welcome to another episode of A Day in the Future. Today we're discussing micromobility and we're doing it together with the founders of Clover, Scott Murphy and Antonio Barbus. We're going to be discussing how macro is going to micro, and we're not talking about physics, we're talking about mobility. So today's episode is about how is micromobility changing the big city life. So let's dive right into it. We're here with Scott Murphy and Antonio Barbus. Thank you for joining us today. I'm very curious to understand how the world is going to be different tomorrow and in the years to come, now that we're moving away from making things bigger and moving with bigger stuff into looking back at what's sustainable actually. So thank you again for being here. I'll let you introduce yourselves as well, and then we can get into Day in the Future and see exactly how micromobility is taking shape.
Yeah, thanks for having us. Really appreciate you taking the time to chat. Yeah, we think the future of mobility is pretty exciting. So I'll introduce myself first. I'm Scott Murphy, co-founder of Clover. Spent most of my career in the advertising business, but more recently have really caught the mobility bug, moving people, moving stuff. Most recently co-founded a startup in London called Finn, which is a last mile logistics business that moves parcels from inner city micro fulfillment hubs to people's homes. So think about things like Amazon, HelloFresh, Grind Coffee, stuff like that. And then now here we are in Valencia, Spain, co-founded Clover with Antonio and our third co-founder, Nick. And we're doing subscription electric mobility with unlimited e-bikes. But Antonio, you want to introduce yourself?
Just to follow on, thanks again, Catalin, for having us. Antonio Barbus, or Barbus, as you would say in Romanian.
Yeah, okay. I wasn't sure about that, so thanks for correcting it.
No problem. So yeah, as Scott mentioned, one of the co-founders of Clover. I'm an engineer at heart. I was born in Romania, moved around a lot as a kid, and essentially became very, very obsessed with how things move. Simply because I moved a lot, and I became obsessed with how things move. Got into engineering quite young. I met Scott a few early years into my career at his time at Finn, and that's how we became friends. That's how we are business partners. I've got quite a pretty short career, but yeah, that's me.
Okay, awesome. Thank you for the introduction. So we're going to talk about how is micro mobility changing big city life. At least from my point of view, that's the main thing that it's changing right now. And just as sort of like a context on how I view it, if for thousands of years we were moving with horses, that was like the main mobility vehicle that we had, then there was the car and the planes and the rocket ships, like everything was bigger, macro, like just thinking about how we can go farther away and how we can just put more engine into it. Now there's a fundamental shift if we're talking about mobility here, because we're looking at how we can be more efficient, right, and how we can be more sustainable in the way we move, especially in big cities. So my question for you is, what's the fundamental change, or what's fundamentally changing right now, so that we are looking at innovation in micro mobility instead of macro, as we've done for the past 200 years or so?
Yeah, I mean, I think as transportation evolved, we were trading efficiency for comfort and space, right? So as we moved from horses to cars, they moved more quickly, but also because they were bigger, they were more enclosed, they were perceived as, safer and more comfortable. I think when we did that, there was a perception that because we could move faster in a car, we could, because of the engine, in the early days, let's say, 2, 5, 10 horsepower, there's this perception that you could move faster. And that's exactly what it was. It ultimately was a perception that you could move faster. We've learned now that the more roads you build, the more traffic you encourage, and again, the slower you go. And I think to your point, as you talk about densely populated urban areas, like big cities, the use of a car becomes less and less efficient as time goes on. And so what that perceived trade-off for comfort and safety, we lost a lot in efficiency and convenience. And so when we think about micromobility let's just call it two-wheeled electric transportation, or transportation that takes up a lot less space than a car and moves a lot more people at the same amount of space, we regain that efficiency that we had back when we were on a horse and we were really, kind of unlimited in our transportation space. So I think for us, it's almost going back to that same type of ethos and really thinking about how can you move as many people in a very similar amount of space as efficiently as possible, and using electric two-wheeled mobility is really, I think, for us, definitely the future, and particularly bicycles.
So if you were to look at, because that's something that we touched upon when we last discussed as well, like if we look at Lime, if we look at those guys, like, and the Bolt scooters and such, what's different on how you approach it? How are you creating more value to the end user through the way that Clover is doing things?
Yeah, I mean, I think if you take a step back and look at the kind of shared scooter boom of, let's call it like 2016 to 2018, no one disagrees that it's not a more efficient and more effective way to get around a densely populated city. I think the biggest issue that those guys had was they ran kind of headlong into rapid geographic expansion without really nailing a business model, right? Like scooters are awesome. Like they are a way better way to get around a city than a car, but not for €7 for a journey that you do, that might be €2 on a train. So the economics of it didn't work out. And I think that's the biggest difference for us with Clover. We came into this, first of all, with bicycles. We think they're a much safer, much more effective way to get around than a scooter. And then secondly, we went into this with the business model in mind. That was the first thing we looked at. We already knew that two-wheeled, what you would call pedelec transportation was going to be ideal and optimal. So that's anything that's a two-wheeled vehicle with an electric motor on it that you also can pedal. So we knew that the efficiency was already there. It was really about how do you make it affordable for the end user and also profitable as a business. And I think that was the biggest mistake that was made in what I call kind of the VC gold rush of micromobility, was everyone knew there was money out there to be had from VCs to fund these businesses. But ultimately, they had no path to profitability. And as they started to figure out, okay, well, we need to be charging more for what we're offering, the consumer wasn't willing to pay more. They thought, oh, there's better options. Maybe Uber is more, efficient or cheaper at that moment than it was to pay so much more for a two-wheeled scooter. But for us, again, we came in, we think a subscription model where it's basically unlimited usage, and what we call ownership as a service for a monthly fee. We see that as a much better way to build a profitable and potentially very revenue positive business.
And what are the markets where you see a product market fit already, where you see it more attainable faster? Well, what are the characteristics? I'm asking also because, like, uh, in my mind, when I'm thinking about a big city life, I'm thinking about New York. And from what I know, you've been there a big part of your life. Because I would like if you can also make a parallel to how adoption would take place there and why.
Yeah, I mean, I can speak briefly about I did a bicycle pilot when I was at Revel, or helped do a bicycle pilot when I was at Revel, and it was the concept was extremely popular. We piloted it with 100 bicycles in Brooklyn and Queens, and by the time the list had gone up for signups, it was something like over 80,000 people had signed up, in the wait list. That said, I think that the government regulation and the infrastructure in some place like New York doesn't really support something like this now. I think in the very near future that will change. There's a lot of movement, particularly just talking about New York City, towards being more cycle friendly. That said, the American psyche is never going to be able to separate itself from its love for four-wheeled, gas guzzling, carbon emission belching cars. Americans love cars. And, one of the things I talk about a lot is the fact that even if Americans immediately fell in love with EVs, the infrastructure really isn't there to support a full stop EV adoption across the board. And some of the goals that have been set even for the 2030, 2035 even those are somewhat unrealistic. So back to your question about what market is really ideal for us. Part of the reason we chose Valencia is that it's a city that has said out loud to the residents, look, private car ownership is not ideal in densely populated urban areas. We see that cars are obviously going to be part of the transportation cocktail, but it's not going to be your primary mode of transportation. So, markets I think we think about are, anything sub 1.5 million in population, very good cycling infrastructure. The weather really isn't a factor for us because if you think about some of the, cities in the world where cycling is most prevalent, it's in some of the worst weather in, well, not the worst weather, but coldest, wettest, rainiest weather in the world. And so that's not necessarily that much of a roadblock for us. But it's also cities that aren't well served by things like shared, dockless and dock shared mobility services. So for us right now, Valencia, moving into Malaga and other cities within Spain, but then certainly mid-sized cities in Germany, Italy, France, those are really high on our priority list. And then also, if you look at the landscape in Latin America, cycling and cycling infrastructure in Latin America is way ahead of North America. And so for us, again, natural fit, Spanish-based business, we're going to be pretty firmly translated and localized into Spanish language already. So it's a market we understand. Obviously, Latin America, very different from Spain, but it's a natural fit for us given infrastructure and all of that kind of stuff.
Yeah, it makes sense. But Antonio, how do you see a fit in the Romanian market, giving Romanians love for their cars? Because we also do love our cars very much.
I come from Vâlcea, so I can only speak. I haven't spent much time outside of that, so I can only speak for where I was in Băbeni, where there is no infrastructure for cycling, more or less. So I think we're a way away from where I come from in Romania. We're a way away from adopting cycling as a daily mode of transport for the large majority of the population. But in places like Cluj and Bucharest, I think there's great potential. I know there's a lot. There's e-mobility rentals. There's some really cool guys that are doing a very similar service, but they're focusing more on B2B, and they're absolutely crushing it. And they started off in Cluj, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, Cluj.
And they've shown that it can be done in Romania. So unfortunately, I haven't spent much time outside of Vâlcea, which is a very, very small town, where I mean, right now it would be not impossible, but very difficult to tap into with Clover. But yeah, I think it's definitely possible in the bigger cities, and it's already being done.
Yes, like from what we were discussing, it feels like there needs to be a deep collaboration with the authorities. Like it's sort of like a B2G to C, but like indirect in a way. So how are you approaching like authorities? How are you approaching the government in yeah, accelerating adoption?
We're very lucky with Valencia because the government already understands and already believes that it is, they understand that it's the future and it's what it should be on a daily basis. Unfortunately, you have places like Madrid where the political landscape took a complete 180 and protests were made about taking the cycle lanes off the street and removing the cycle lanes. So it's a big part of it is luck. Ultimately we're very lucky with who we have in power in Valencia, and they're true believers of pedestrianizing and adopting cycling as a daily mode of transport rather than cars. And unfortunately, I was in Madrid, just came back from Madrid yesterday, and one of the biggest struggles that I had was moving around because the buses are super slow. The train was, well, it was accessible, but you had to, I walked a lot. I did a lot of walking, and unfortunately, there wasn't really many shared options outside of the mopeds. So it comes down, we can try our best to try and help people understand and educate people on how beneficial it is to have cycling as a daily mode of transport, or or walking, or even mopeds, I think, to some extent. But it's very difficult when people are stuck. Americans, as Scott mentioned, Americans love their cars, and it's quite it's a challenge to change people's minds on something that they love, right? So I think it comes down to luck ultimately, and it's a matter of timing. And I think again, as I mentioned, we're very lucky to be in Valencia, where the government believes in our mission.
Okay, so yeah, it's a good launch pad then for having success stories to share with other cities, and yeah, yeah. So one thing that I'm curious about, like how are you approaching? Because I've seen this part of the friction from the government side. Like one thing is that with limes and bolts and such, there was a lot of visual pollution on the roads. Like how are you approaching that differently? Because that's one, like if you're with, I don't know, with your baby, and like with the troller and the yeah, that's not beneficial for the citizens. So I believe that there's an area that created friction. And how are you looking at that?
I think very quickly I can put in giving people a sense of ownership over their mode of transport. I think adds a lot of solves the part of parking, for example, right? So when I was in London, we don't have linemen or anything like that in Valencia, but when I was in London, there was a as you said, visual.
It's just street trash.
Yeah,
It's
exactly.
just street trash. Yeah, there's no other way to put it.
Yeah.
So I think giving people a sense of ownership definitely helps solve that, because people think at the end of the day, this is mine for the time that I've got it. So I'm going to look after it. I'm going to park it nicely. I'm not going to just park it in the middle of the pavement. There's a lot of things that add to it, but and especially, one thing that I was guilty of this, and I'm ashamed to say this, but when I was using Lime in London, I would be in a rush, and I would end up having to park it. I'd go to park it, or I want to park nicely, and I'd get told, no, you need to go to a parking zone. So then I'd have to rush again to another parking zone. It's all full of fallen over bikes, and unfortunately, I was just part of that problem, because I'm not going to sit there and lift up all the bikes that are fallen on the floor, obstructing the parking. I'm just going to park it where I physically can, and then keep moving. Run to my destination, because I'm now 10 minutes late. So I think that's another thing. People will take a lot more pride in a Clover bike. They take a lot more pride because it's yours ultimately. It's not something that you pick up, you let go, and someone else is going to jump on it and break the pedals the next morning. So I think that's my take on it. Scott.
Yeah, I mean, I think a big part of this is, Antonio mentioned it, the kind of restricted parking regulations within London. So what he alluded to is this idea that, typically, or early days of Lime, you could, cycle the Lime to wherever you wanted, particularly in places like Islington and Hackney, and you could park anywhere on the sidewalk, or the footpath for my British friends. Now, in the case of Islington, for example, where I lived, there are restricted parking zones. So you can't actually cycle to where you want to go. If you don't know where those restricted parking zones are, you do exactly what Antonio did. You cycle to where you want to go. You go, oh, I'm going to lock the bike. And the bike says, no, you can't lock here. You have to go, across the street, across another street to a parking zone. And I mean, it happened to him. It happened to me all the time. I have 1,000 kilometers on Lime. And so that becomes incredibly inconvenient. It also turns it into a business problem for Lime. So Lime just announced recently that they're going to spend, what did they say?
25 million.
Yeah, 25 million on growing their team, adding additional restricted parking zones where you can park bicycles, and spending a lot of time and energy kind of cleaning up this street trash. And so what that says to me is that you're just taking away from the bottom line by having to compensate for all these problems that you're experiencing by this dockless model. And ultimately, it becomes not a dockless model. Yeah, there maybe isn't a dock that you lock the bike into at this point, but the bike has to be parked in a restricted parking area. I think the biggest benefit for us, and by the way, no dig on Lime. Again,
We love those guys.
1,000 kilometers on Lime. I absolutely love Lime bikes. And it's a great thing if you're going out at night and you're going to the pub and you don't know where you're going to end up. You don't want to take an owned bicycle at that point. Like, even if you owned it, forget about a subscription bicycle. You wouldn't want to take your $3,000 e-bike to the pub on a Friday night. You have no idea where you're going to end up. So Lime is perfect for that. For us, it's as Antonio said, the sense of ownership. You park it at your house, you cycle it to wherever you want, you park it wherever you want in effective and safe bicycle parking. And it's a similar experience to Lime in that if you need a new battery, you just go to one of our battery swapping stations and get a fresh battery. So one of the biggest things for me, and the reason I used Lime so prolifically when I was there, is I don't have to worry about charging. I don't have to worry about remembering to plug in my bike at night. I don't have to try to bring it down the stairs or any of that kind of stuff, or the safety of charging a lithium-ion battery in my house. Now, the vehicles we're using, they're from a German manufacturer called Bello DeVille, extremely safe batteries. It would be almost impossible for you to set one of these batteries on fire. But it's a concern that everybody has, and it's something that's in the news all the time. So when you combine the convenience factor of a Lime-like experience with a sense of ownership, I think you, as far as I'm concerned, almost entirely eliminate that kind of street trash. And then I think one quick thing on bicycles versus scooters. I think the perception of a rider on a bicycle, and I'm not talking about a crazy cyclist. Like we all know crazy cyclists, they have those funny hats and they wear Lycra and they scream at cars. Normal people aren't like that. And I think normal people riding a subscribed e-bike are going to obey the rules more frequently than someone on a scooter. And that's a big point for us here in Valencia in particular, and I think across Spain, is the modified scooters that you can buy off the internet are extremely dangerous. And the city government here are cracking down heavily on those, so much so that the police have actually bought a dyno to test the power of these illegal scooters to see if they're too powerful and take them off the street. So there's a war on scooters here. And we think that, again, another element of why we can be successful in Valencia, Spain, and broader Europe is because this is a safe, well-constructed bicycle.
I think that's a very fair point, like, and very reasonable assumptions regarding the timing and the ownership part. Yeah, I didn't look at it like that, but it makes sense. Now, if we're talking about ownership, I would ask, like, why would I use Clover instead of just buying myself? Like, why wouldn't I do that?
Do you have 3,000 euros right now to spare for an e-bike?
Well, no, no. That's a good point. Yeah.
There you go. No, that was the easiest one for us to solve, by the way, was the cost. So the two barrier to entries, and just to be clear for us, we're trying to move people out of cars and into e-bikes. That's a long journey, right? Cyclists who are currently cycling, who don't want to be sweaty when they get to work in the summer, that's an easy sell. Very easy to get them to convert to an e-bike. But to get people out of cars into e-bikes, you have to solve a lot of different problems along that way. So first problem we were solving is the cost. Now, obviously, it's much cheaper to get an e-bike than it is to get a car, but it's still 3,000 euros, let's call it, for the bike that we have. So most people don't have 3,000 euros laying around to drop on an e-bike. So solving that subscription model, that was the first thing that was easy to solve. The second thing we had to solve for was this concept of convenience. So when people own an ICE car, it's very seamless in your life, right? You get in, turn the key, drive where you want to go, maybe spend 20 minutes looking for parking, but that's a different story. If you are seemingly running out of gas, you go to a gas station, you pump some gas into it, 5-10 minutes, you're back on the road. With an e-bike, there was this perception of a lack of convenience, right? Because I have to remember to charge the battery. It takes 6 hours. If I forget, it's kind of useless.
I have to take it up the stairs. I have to
Yeah,
remember to
exactly.
maintain
It's
it.
heavy,
Yeah.
it might blow up in my house, even though we're pretty sure it won't. But if you eliminate that anxiety around being able to use this as a daily vehicle for transportation, that's where battery as a service comes in. And I'll tell you what, when we mention this to most Europeans, they're like, why won't people remember to charge their battery? And it's like, yeah, maybe most people will remember, but if you don't have to remember, that makes it as convenient as a car. So I can now get up in the morning, cycle to a battery swapping station, swap the battery. And even if I only do that 2 or 3 times a week, I don't have to think about it. It's always there. The energy is always available. It's just like filling up a car. And I think that's the biggest thing. And listen, in China, India, they've figured it out. They said, forget about charging at home. Don't even bother with it. Battery swapping in e-bikes and scooters and cars and trucks,
It's huge.
it's the future there. Now, do I think it's a long-term future? Solid state batteries, totally different story. But where we are now with the lithium ion and LiFePO and all of that, it's swapping is the quickest way to fully re-energize your vehicle. And that for us unlocked that consumer objection. So when people said, oh, okay, I don't have to worry about charging, just a minor worry that was going to be something in the back of my mind is just gone now. And it's only 65 euros a month. Like, yeah, I can see a world where I get rid of my car. Even if you have a family, you get a family cargo bike, and those are starting to spike in popularity across Europe, but particularly in Valencia, we're starting to see a tremendous number of people implementing those. Now, those are people who have the money to buy a very expensive family cargo bike. But again, with us, even if you want to go month to month on a family cargo bike, it's only 179 a month euros. that's still way cheaper than your car, gas, insurance, parking, everything. So yeah, I mean, again, that those consumer objections were the two that we really had to push through. And now that we think this is a much more viable transportation method.
And so, are you creating that infrastructure for batteries? Oh, okay. Okay,
So
well,
that's another interesting government collaboration, right? So we've just started working with a group which is called Invest Valencia. And part of what they do is connect businesses who want to come to Valencia with the government. And we're actually meeting, I think it's next week, with what are called the regulatory sandbox team. And so this is a team within the government of Valencia that will help you bypass all that regulatory overhead that typically is involved with using public infrastructure space and allow startups to test and try new things. And that is the main goal of this team, is for startups to try new things in Valencia. And we were at VDS, this is last year, and the mayor of Valencia, who strongly believes in the startup community here, stood up on stage and said, if you're a startup and you want to try something and it's not dangerous, come to Valencia. We will help you do it. And we met with Paula Lobet, who's the deputy mayor for innovation and tourism. And that was exactly the same message. It wasn't something that was just being said from the top that wasn't being acted upon. You know, we're actively in the process of meeting with them now to secure locations for these battery swapping stations. So, you know, again, you've just got this government tailwinds that are helping us with this mission. So it makes places like Valencia very easy.
that that's very exciting to hear. Like they're really working towards making Europe, at least that part of Europe, an innovation and test bed, and that's amazing. Yeah, like I haven't heard that. Like actually, like I have heard that before, but actually being applied, I haven't heard that that many times.
Yeah.
Yeah, because that's the tough part.
Yeah, I mean, when I ran for New York City Council, this is a few years ago, that was part of what I was pushing for, you know, was this implementation of this idea of regulatory sandboxing. It's allowing, and it doesn't happen in the States, not anywhere that I've ever heard of. And actually, to be honest, when I was at VDS and she started talking about this, and I was struggling to do my best to understand what she was saying in Spanish, but then she just said regulatory sandboxing. I was like, whoa, wait, this is happening in Valencia? Like I was shocked actually, and at simultaneously pleasantly surprised. And then when we found out that it was a real thing that we could take advantage of, and another just quick interesting thing about it, not to go off on a tangent, is that it's this idea of regulatory sandboxing, but also democratization, right? So they said to us, yeah, we'll help you put these cabinets on the street and put your charged batteries in them, but you also have to let other companies providing a similar service put their batteries in the cabinet too. And we're like, that's fine. We love that because that just means more people riding e-bikes, more people riding, you know, battery swappable electric mopeds. So for us, yeah, it's again, we're Antonio says we're lucky. We are very lucky about Valencia, and we're not naive in knowing that expanding beyond this essentially transportation utopia is going to be challenging. But if we figure it out here and we can get that model perfected here, it'll make it a lot easier for us to move other places.
Yes, definitely. And what do you see right now as the main detractors and the main accelerators in getting where you want to get next? In terms of, I would look more at consumer behavior because, yeah, that's where adoption actually happens. Like a lot of innovations are created during our lives, but the ones that get adopted are actually the ones that really succeed.
Yeah, I mean, I think, and Antonio, jump in. I mean, I think genuinely battery as a service is going to unlock a whole new layer of people who will want to move into electric mobility. I think previously it was very geeky, right? Like, and geeky things are kind of like, ew, I don't want to get involved in that. But if we can make it more mainstream, I think the battery as a service will help tremendously with that. I think also there's a little bit of like an ick factor with shared mobility. You know, I know, like, again, for example, I use the shared mopeds in Valencia all the time. I've finally convinced my girlfriend that they're safe to ride on the back, but like she's putting a hairnet on every time she puts that shared helmet on because there is this little bit of an ick factor. And so I think for us, overcoming the idea that cars are super convenient and convincing people like, hey, actually, you're not going to be sitting in traffic anymore. You're going to be getting where you want to go more actively and maybe a little bit more quickly. I think those are probably the biggest things that we have to overcome. I think if we step outside of Valencia, it's cycling infrastructure, right? Again, I think we can do a really good job and we have really solid messaging to convince car owners that this is a better way to get around. But I think having the infrastructure in place and having people believe in that as a mode of day-to-day transportation is a challenge. And then, I mean, just like with every other startup, we're not AI B2B SaaS. So fundraising, fundraising is always a challenge. That's not a consumer objection, but it's a genuine challenge. But even that we're getting through.
Given because you do have a sustainability component, strong one in your value proposition, both for the consumer and the governments, uh, is the shift in geopolitical direction that has taken place over the last few months impacted the way investors look at sustainability overall? I'm just curious if it's something that you've seen during your, because I suppose you've had conversations from before.
Yeah, I mean, I think that overall, first of all, the world is still focused on sustainability. I think what's happening in the US, obviously, there are some things that are going to slow down adoption, particularly of EVs. Announcements recently about the end to federal funding for certain, well, for quite large programs that had already been kind of pushed into implementation, that being scaled back. I think, look, there's definitely going to be a slowdown. I definitely think, I 100% think that adoption will continue. It will continue at a slightly slower rate. And then in terms of investor sentiment, I mean, I think overall, particularly in Europe, if you're speaking to the right people, people who care about environmental sustainability genuinely, which is a very small group, they still care about it and they still think that it's important. And the other thing I think that's important to talk about is consumers still care about it. So they still see the environment as a huge issue personally. And so for us, it's when we're speaking to investors now, you talk about the conversion to EVs, cars and trucks as EVs. That adoption rate might slow down. And so that might slow down people's ability to have a significant impact on the environment personally. But the adoption rate of e-bikes and things like that, that will continue, I assume, in Europe, particularly on the track that it's on now. And that allows us to actually achieve some of those climate goals that we were aiming to achieve with cars much more quickly by switching to e-bikes instead of cars. The other thing about an e-bike, which is I'm sure plainly obvious to everyone, is it takes 85% less energy to charge an e-bike than it does to charge a car. So we just make leaps and bounds in that efficiency and that impact on the environment by moving out. You leapfrog from an ICE vehicle to an e-bike. Your environmental impact is so much more significant by doing that than it would be if you just moved into an EV.
And just to jump in with a cool fact about the difference between cars, emissions on cars and emissions on things like bikes. An e-bike will emit 14.8 grams of carbon dioxide per kilometer, which is 6 grams lower than a normal bike, by the way, right? Just a normal pedal-powered, human-powered bike. And an average ICE car emits 121 grams per kilometer, right? So when you look at that, I mean, the difference is huge. And it was a really weird fact for me to learn that e-bikes are actually emit less than a normal bike. And, that's down to the foods that we eat and such. But just wanted to put that fact in there.
When you look at competition on the medium long term, are you looking at cars or are you also looking at public transportation systems?
It's a very interesting question, right? And we can go a million ways about it. I think from my side, we see it as Scott said earlier, a transportation cocktail. We see it as a mixture of different modes of transport combined because, we like to say that we hate cars, but at the end of the day, there will be a time in people's lives and people's years and daily lives that you need a car. You need to go to IKEA and pick something up. You go and you rent a car for the day, but you don't need to own it. That's the ultimate message we're putting across. I think public transportation is another big part. And again, we don't see ourselves as competing, and we just, we see ourselves as a part of the transportation cocktail. It's a mixture, you need a mixture of things, a number of ingredients to bake the cake, essentially.
And I think if you look at something like let's talk about like a few use cases, right? Like you're gonna cycle to work every day. That's kind of a given, right? That's if you adopt this mode of transportation. You're not going to cycle to the airport with your luggage for a holiday. So in that sense, we're saying, yeah, take the train if the train's available, take the bus if the bus is available. If not, ride hail is a great option. There's absolutely no reason for you to drive a privately owned car to the airport for a holiday and then park it at the airport, pay 30 pounds a day to park in private parking. There is no reason. We also are saying don't cycle to the airport. That's madness. What are you going to do? Tow your bags behind you as you're cycling along? Like, don't do that either. So public transit is always going to be a part of people's transportation cocktail. I think it's just a matter of, as Antonio says, you don't need to own a private car in a densely populated urban area. And as we start to talk about kind of the future of Clover, let's call it 5 years from now, if you look at your phone, Antonio could show us, I don't have my phone handy. You have on average 6 to 8 transportation apps on your phone at any one time. So like for me, I have Cooltra, Yigo, Cabify, Free Now, Valen BC. I have Lime for when I go to London. I have Trainline for taking the train. I have the EMT app for the buses in Valencia. So it's on and on and on. Never forget about Expedia and hotels.com and all these things that are, ancillary transportation apps. For us, it's even just trying to consolidate in half. So if we can integrate, on-demand shared mobility, subscription model that we're offering, subscription mopeds, if we can offer things like car sharing, even if it's through partners, and certainly car sharing partners, we would love to hear from you because there's no good car sharing options in Valencia. And then obviously external to that, things like rental cars, integrating rental car options into our app. What we want eventually is for this to be a place that people go when they need transportation. And so I think as you think in the future, again, as someone as an urbanite, let's say, you're going to need a number of different tools in your toolbox to get around. And all we're saying is we want to be a part of that journey one way or another, whether it's a subscribed e-bike like we're doing today or reserving a car sharing service through our app in the future.
Oh, okay, got it. So then what's actually the vision and mission of Clover? Because it's actually a bit more broader than I initially thought.
I mean, the vision is to make healthier and happier cities. That's our global vision ultimately. And so, how are we going to achieve that is by offering, and Antonio is going to pull it up so that I can get it verbatim, but it's by offering effective transportation solutions that have very low impact on the environment and that are as convenient as other modes of transportation. I think ultimately long term, we see this as an ecosystem. Again, we call it a cocktail, call it an ecosystem.
Yeah, I really like that. I really like the transportation cocktail.
So
Yeah,
our vision is cities that nurture healthier, happier, everyday lives for as many people as possible. And our mission is to deliver mobility and logistics solutions that are accessible, reliable, and environmentally friendly. So in a nutshell, we want greener cities, happier people, healthier people, etc.
And a healthier planet.
And yeah, and you're starting with at least right now what makes sense given the timing of the market and the evolution. Yeah. Okay, and if we look a bit more, like there are so many things happening right now, like in terms of innovation. Like okay, last year was mostly AI, but it's also gonna be the way we move. Like how far will it get from your perspective in, I don't know, 10 years from now, 20 years from now? How far do you see it going when it comes to sustainable living in big cities? Are there going to be new forms of transportation? Is there going to be new models? Like anything that you'd like to just talk about because it's far away. I know that, but just talking about it.
On the topic of new modes of transportation, we heard a guy speak about what he's doing and the startup that he's working on, right? And it's air mobility, right? The future of air mobility, essentially. So, electrified VTOLs. Scott is more into air mobility than I am, so he can probably explain it a little bit better. But the future that he sees is, going on your phone and saying, I need to get from Valencia to Madrid or whatever the capabilities are. And instead of taking a train, you just kind of go on your phone and get in a VTOL. So Scott, feel free to jump in. You're more clued up on air mobility than I am.
No, I mean that's one of what I think will be many. I mean, I think urban air mobility. So I was in an urban air mobility startup in 2016. So very early days, we were using latent charter inventory in the US to enable these kind of short distance single engine aircraft, very short journeys. They were still very expensive. To get from New York to Martha's Vineyard was still about $3,000. So really restrictive to who could afford it. But I think in the very near future, you'll unlock this amazing superpower of being able to get around through the air. And I think, to be fair, or in my opinion, that will probably happen in densely populated urban areas much more quickly than robo-taxis. When you look at autonomous driving capabilities in a place like New York or even Valencia, frankly, we're still a long way off from that fully autonomous vehicle. I think in closed environments, they're great. I think eventually they will be amazing in cities, but I think you'll see widespread adoption of urban air mobility before that. And I think if you talk about, and I like to point out, by the way, that urban air mobility is actually not that new, that in the 60s and 70s, you could fly a helicopter from JFK and LaGuardia to Midtown Manhattan on the Pan Am building right in Midtown Manhattan for about $70. That's not that expensive. And it was like a flying bus, by the way. You've seen those helicopters from Vietnam that had the counter rotating rotors. Same exact thing was landing on the roof of a building in Midtown Manhattan in the 70s. So unfortunately, there was an accident that put an end to that. I think what's happening now is we're building tremendously safe, tremendously advanced machines that are going to be able to do this in a very efficient and safe way. So I think you'll see urban air mobility starting to roll out even as soon as this year. You'll start seeing adoption in some of the more forward-thinking countries with more regulation like the US and countries in Europe. It'll be a little bit more of a challenge, but I mean, again, we saw a startup based in Valencia that's working on urban air mobility infrastructure. And I think, Antonio mentioned Valencia to Madrid. I think it's even going to be, one side of Manhattan to the other, to avoid crosstown traffic, Manhattan to Brooklyn, LA to Santa Monica, that kind of stuff, San Francisco to Oakland, journeys that take hours in a car will take 7 minutes in an eVTOL. So I think those are coming. And then, yeah, I mean, I think eventually the robo-taxi will be a thing. I think in the short term, it'll be for much longer journeys, or in less densely populated areas like the suburbs or in controlled environments. But those are the two I think that are probably coming the fastest. Outside of that, anybody's game. I don't think it's going to be a hyperloop, though. I think we're pretty sure that hyperloop is maybe not going to be a thing.
Okay, and in this transportation cocktail of the future, okay, well, what do you think are the main challenges so that we make sure it's a good recipe and it's yeah, it's gonna taste good?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's options and convenience, right? Part of why I think, we talk about public transportation, here in Valencia, the buses come every 15 minutes. I think that there needs to be some radical changes in, for example, the way things work in terms of bus transportation. If you look at, there's a company that was started in New York called Via, and it's essentially a bus-sized on-demand vehicle, right? So it's kind of like ride hail, and it consolidates a group of riders into a journey that's very similar to one another. I think there's going to be stuff like that.
Is it a recurring journey?
It can be recurring, but there's also kind of just on demand, like 10 people all want to go to the mall at roughly around the same time. We accommodate them in that way. I think another thing that's really exciting for me that's starting to be adopted massively here in Valencia is scheduled and unscheduled carpooling. Like, I think if you're going to have a car, if you can get a group together and you're all taking roughly the same journey and you put 4 people in a car that normally has one, that's massive. But I think back to your point about how do we make this cocktail tasty and effective, it's got to come down to options that are as convenient as as the existing status quo, right? So again, and that's why I think e-bikes play a big part in this. Right now, when you want to go to work, you get in your car, you drive to work. It's that convenient. If the new modes are not that convenient, it's not going to be adopted. And I think that this is a big problem with EVs and understanding the adoption of EVs. I have a little podcast, nothing like yours, but we talk about EV adoption. And one of the biggest things is infrastructure, right?
Yeah.
If you live at home and you have a Kia EV9 or whatever, you plug it in overnight and your dryer plug maybe, and you're fully charged when you wake up in the morning, everything's, great. But if you live in Brooklyn and you have a Kia EV9, you need to find curbside charging. And in Brooklyn right now, there's none. Not none, but it's very limited. So then your next option is DC fast charging, right? Or what some people might call level 3 charging. Now you go to DC fast charging in Brooklyn, sometimes it doesn't work. Sometimes there's a queue, so we're not there yet with EVs where it's as efficient as a regular gas powered car. And so until we get there, it's just not going to be as viable of an option as a nice vehicle. The big difference with us, and again with an e-bike, so as soon as you on day one, and I think that's the biggest thing. Again, it's convenience.
It's also habits, right? Habits come into it quite a lot because we've spoken to people and they're like, well, why would I ride my bike when it's raining? And we just say, look at Amsterdam. It's always raining, it's always cold. People ride, Amsterdam is the cycling hub of the world. And
by the way, Valencia is number 7 in that list of
Lucky
top
number
10.
7.
Yeah, lucky number 7. Listen, I'll take number 7. In best cities for cycling. But yeah, sorry.
So, it's about habits. As Scott mentioned, Americans don't want to get rid of their cars. That's just habit, right? This is what you got accustomed to. This is what your day-to-day normal life is. If you're born in Amsterdam, your day-to-day life is seeing bikes, and you're like, well, I'm going to get on a bike. Why would I get in a car and then just get obstructed by the bikes that are in front of me? Slowing me down and the cars, etc. So, a big thing of it as well is just breaking habits and convenient method of moving around. Sit in traffic, arrive, and sure, it's convenient, it's warm, you've got music, but at the end of the day, it's not an efficient way to move around.
No, you're right. You're right.
It
And
also breaks the bank.
yeah, and the infrastructure, like, because that's a key word that we've touched upon a couple of times during our conversation today. It's basically the main ingredient in this cocktail, and being able to from now to influence how that main ingredient is being, like where it's gonna go at, that's key. And I think that's like what one very strong point on what you're doing is the fact that you are creating that infrastructure for what you are bringing in as a solution, and in doing so, at the end of the day, who do you think are going to be the winners in creating the infrastructure of tomorrow for micromobility?
I mean, it's going to be people who adopt battery swapping for right now, to be honest. I mean, I think when we look at micromobility in terms of bicycles and, for example, mopeds, because mopeds are extremely popular here, in dockless systems that require a huge army of battery swappers swapping batteries in mopeds, it's very expensive. It makes it very difficult to achieve profitability. Listen, I worked on a fleet of over 7,000 mopeds in Brooklyn and the 4 main boroughs of New York. I understand the economics of it. So having that battery swapping element is going to be huge. I think the other part of that is, to your point, in a broader sense of infrastructure, it's kind of like both happening at the same time, right? We need to drive adoption of EVs so that cities continue to develop additional infrastructure to support that adoption. The nice thing about Valencia is they see the vision. They already understand that cars aren't the answer or the only answer. And so they're driving that adoption by installing infrastructure. So they're a little bit ahead of the game. I think other cities and other countries around the world will start to see that. There's some sad news out of Toronto that they're basically ripping out tons of bike lanes and replacing them with cars. There's going to continue to be car lanes. Sorry, there's going to continue to be stuff like that happening. But I think that if we can, at the same time, push adoption of e-bikes and prove to municipalities that this is a viable and useful and effective mode of transportation, they will continue to adopt that infrastructure. That said, I think that the private sector probably is going to push the infrastructure play forward when it comes to energy, right? If you think about energy, and I was speaking to someone a couple of weeks ago about they called electric vehicle charging electric fuel. And if you think about existing fuel, no one buys their gasoline for their car from the government. That's all been driven by the private sector. I think it's going to be a very similar situation with electric mobility, and you're seeing that now. Private charging infrastructure is happening within Valencia. Iberola, for example, has charging stations throughout the city. You're not seeing that implementation on the government side. They're pushing that to the private sector. I think you'll continue to see that with the EV revolution, whether it's a two-wheel e-bike or a four-wheeled electric car. I think the private sector will continue to drive that. And anywhere someone like us can start to get ahead of that innovation. And again, we know battery swapping works from places like China and India. If we can prove out that model here, and especially in a place that has kind of favorable tailwinds for us like Valencia, we can start to push that out to other cities in Europe.
How are those locations picked? Like, how do you select the locations for battery swap changes?
Population density is a big part of it. That's the main.
And I'm just curious if there are any strategic partnerships that can be made right now so that you bring in more incentivized stakeholders in the infrastructure.
Yeah, I think the public-private partnership is a big one, but I think as we're looking to grow our subscriber base within Valencia, universities are a huge opportunity for us. So partnering with universities, installing that battery swapping infrastructure there to make it more convenient for students. I think that also gets people in early, right? Like, oh, battery swapping's cool. Like I can get wherever I want to go, even to go on the weekends to a national park, I can swap my battery and be on my way. So I think partnerships like that, but then also, it's things like parking garages. Again, it's not going to be exclusively public access facilities, but places like parking garages. Here in Valencia, there are a lot of kind of vending machine shops where it's, a shop that's essentially just vending machines open 24 hours. We see a lot of opportunities with people like that to get the infrastructure installed in place there. And then a big one for us is we're pushing hard to implement our corporate benefits program. So for example, there are a lot of large business parks within Valencia. One of the largest ones is kind of spearheaded by Ford Motor Company. So once we engage with Ford and we have this as a corporate benefit for their employees, a pre-tax benefit, then they're going to be more motivated to help us install these battery swapping stations within those campuses because the employees want the benefit. The employees need the batteries in order to get around. It benefits everybody. And then I think speaking just briefly about Ford, OEMs in general at this stage are looking to diversify their portfolios. So it's a benefit to Ford employees, but we're also speaking to people like the innovation centers and the VCs and corporate VCs within these OEMs to say, hey guys, you're going to sell less cars. Everybody agrees on that right now. When we talk about future of cities, there's micro car sharing amongst families is going to start to happen. So you're going to sell less cars. Maybe get into some bicycles, get into battery swapping. And I think that it's much easier to have that conversation when the 7,000 Ford employees in Valencia all have access to battery swapping on e-bikes. It's a much easier conversation.
Understood. Yeah, it makes sense. It's heading towards that. So, now we've touched upon how the future looks like. Now getting there, what would you recommend for? Let's look at Romania because as we've discussed, we're a bit behind on it. Like, what would you recommend to our government, and what would you recommend to me as a consumer? Well, what should I pay more attention to right now so that I can benefit the most out of that future that it's being paved right now?
I mean, I think it's a few things. I think number one, vote. If you're not voting, vote and vote for people who care
That's
about
essential.
who care about environmental sustainability. As someone who ran for office, that's what I tell everybody. You want to change your city, vote. That said, I think, listen, I've spent some time in Cluj. Our software development firm is in Cluj. And so Cluj is getting there. And I think that, I personally call Cluj the Austin, Texas of Romania. There's a lot of tech happening there. There's a lot of advancements happening there. I think people like us should take advantage of that. Like, the guys that we know, I almost said fully charged. The guys that we know there that are already doing this, they're starting to push that envelope and drive that adoption. And I think if we all continue, the biggest thing I would say as a person is just make the switch. Like, your ICE car sucks. Like, you don't need to own an ICE car.
And let's just think about, how do you get to the point of understanding that it sucks, right? It's thinking about how, so from a personal point, right? How much distance am I covering in how much time? And how much does that cost me when I look at my monthly expenses or my yearly expenses on a car? If I'm covering 2, 3, 5 kilometers a trip, and it's taking me 30, 45 minutes and an hour, etc., and I'm spending 6, 7, 800 euros a month, there's a problem, right? Because even if we didn't exist, you can still take public transport, and in most cases it'll be much cheaper and much faster, right? Yes, it's a little bit less convenient because you have to go and share it, and that's why we're coming, because we want ultimate convenience. You don't have to share the space with anybody. But I think from a personal standpoint, you have to just look at, how much am I spending to achieve this, right? And then you think, what impact does that have on yourself, the city that you're in, the world, and the people around you as in general.
So raise awareness actually on data when it comes to how you're moving around.
Yeah.
Got it. Understood. Well, thank you. So this is the final part where we like to give some good advice to our audience on how can we get towards that future. Thank you very much for sharing with me, for helping me learn that actually we already had urban air mobility from the 60s. I didn't knew that, and it was quite convenient at the time. I'm really looking forward to how Clover is gonna grow and how it's gonna look at the success story in Valencia first and foremost. If there's anything else that you wanted to point out, or if I missed something in our conversation, now's the time to dive into it more.
No, I mean, just really appreciate the chance to come on and talk about what we're doing. And if you want to learn more, go to rideclover.com and check it out.
Okay, awesome, guys. Thank you very much for today's episode, and looking forward to catch up soon.
Thank you so much, Catalin.
Thank you.
Thanks for tuning in, and looking forward to the next episode. If you have any recommendations, write to us on Instagram or on LinkedIn. You can find us on all major podcast platforms and on YouTube. See you next time.